There's a new podcast from the TED Audio Collective I'd love to tell you about. It's called Body Stuff with Dr. Jen Gunter. Body Stuff reveals the lies we're told and sold about our health by exploring how the body actually works and some of the surprising backstories behind the health advice we're given. I mean, is it actually possible to boost your immune system? Do we really need 8 glasses of water a day? Find and follow Body Stuff with Dr. Jen Gunter wherever you're listening to this. Hello, I'm Chris Anderson. Welcome to the TED Interview, where I get to dive much deeper into a speaker's ideas than is possible during their short TED Talk. In 2015, our TED Global Conference featured the economist and author Dambisa Moyo. She took the stage and said something that was almost the opposite of what speakers before her had said.
Our ability to create and sustain economic growth is the defining challenge of our time. Of course, there are other challenges: healthcare, disease burdens and pandemics, environmental challenges, and of course, radicalized terrorism. However, to the extent that we can actually solve the economic growth challenge, it will take us a long way to solving the challenges that I've just elucidated.
So, the importance of economic growth has perhaps never been more evident than today, with the world's economy running in reverse. Yet, Dambisa's views on this and many other topics like overseas aid, climate, democracy, and how we should think about China's surging power remain highly provocative. Just before the coronavirus exploded in the West, I had the opportunity to sit down with Dambisa to get a better sense of her worldview and how we might apply it as we think about rebuilding the future. This was a really fascinating conversation. Let's dive in. So, Dambisa, welcome to the TED Interview.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
I'm very excited for this conversation. I think that there are so many things we're going to cover, I think, in the next hour or so around freedom, around economic growth, around the state of the world, around democracy, around climate, around many other things that you have been thinking about and writing about so thoughtfully. But I think I'd like to just start to get to know you a bit better. Tell us a bit about you, where you grew up. What were any kind of defining moments in your life that put you on the path that you're on today?
Sure, thank you. I was born and raised in Zambia, Southern Africa, one of the poorest countries in the world, unfortunately still true today. At the time of my birth, it's kind of public now, but I was born in 1969, but at the time of my birth, birth certificates were not issued to Blacks. And so for much of my life, not only have I not had a birth certificate, I actually wasn't aware that I didn't have a birth certificate because of the political system, the artifacts of the colonial system, but the political system at that time. As you intimated, I've had a pretty wild ride, as they say, in my 50 years. I've been very fortunate to have been raised in Africa, in the developing world, but also had the opportunity to live and spend a large proportion of my adult life in the West, studying at Oxford and at Harvard, working at the World Bank, but also having visited almost 80 countries around the world, rich and poor, but also democratic and non-democratic. And, today spend a large proportion of my time thinking about the list of issues that you've outlined, doing a lot of writing, and, also serving on corporate boards after 10 years on Wall Street.
And what did you believe about the world as you were growing up, and what changed as you started to study and think about it? What were some of the key sort of aha moments?
Yes, it's a wonderful question because I spent a lot of time looking back on how my beliefs have changed and evolved over time. Being raised in Africa in the 1970s, and really my formative years as a teenager there, we were all, dare I say it, very envious of the Western world. They had economic growth. They had freedoms in terms of political freedoms, but economic freedoms also. And also there was a sense about the pursuit of equality. But, fast forward to come and live in the West and really feel slightly, shall I say, disappointed at the efficacy of many of the ideologies that I aspired to. In particular, market capitalism and liberal democracy. I fundamentally believe in those values, but it is clear that neither of them are operating in the fashion that I had believed and thought when growing up in Africa.
So what was the first instance of that hit home?
Well, I think the first instance is when I graduated from Oxford with my PhD and was hired at Goldman Sachs in London. And it was the 2000s, early 2000s, and there was a big push towards emerging markets converging. I looked around and there were almost no Africans on the trading floor. And, Africa represents about 20% of the world's population. And I just couldn't get my head around it. There were people from Argentina and people from Turkey and from Asia, all across Asia, but almost no Africans, aside from myself and a handful of others. And I realized then that there were sort of different models of economic growth, that there actually had not been a full sort of onboarding or subscription to the values of market capitalism and liberal democracy. And somehow, and I will say, driven by, I believe, compassion, people had said in their minds, market capitalism and democracy are good for these countries, but Africa is somehow ring-fenced from market factors and from the complicated debates around democracy. And I think that seeing no Africans on the trading floor was an artifact of that.
I mean, there was certainly, at that time, there was a huge sense among many people in the West that Africa as a continent was falling behind. And many people converted that into almost like a moral cause to do what could be done to, raise giant sums of aid funding for Africa, to try and make a difference, to tackle some of the problems that people saw there. You came to a very different conclusion about the right response to, how we could address this injustice, that this huge, amazing continent was being left behind. Yeah. And your thinking led to this very provocative book. Came out, I think, in 2009.
Yeah. It wasn't provocative at all. In fact, in many respects, it was kind of obvious. I mean, I can't tell you how many places, not just in Africa, in the emerging markets, people were like, what's the big hoo-ha? It's so obvious. And it was really a big pushback from people in the West, I think.
Well, tell us about that. That book was called Dead Aid.
Yes.
What was the thesis of that book?
Fundamentally, that we can do better. I am a numerical person. I believe in numbers and results as evidence of the success of a paradigm. And we have had over 50 years, since Bretton Woods, really, of an aid regime, which is fundamentally about taking donor money from largely Western countries. It's changed somewhat recently, but largely Western countries, and providing that money to governments in Africa. Well, specifically talking about Africa, but it applied to many countries around the world. There's a lot of nuance in this because, I was very clear that I was not talking about the Christmas money people send, $20 for a well in Kenya or $10 here at Christmas to support a girl going to school. I mean, those are small beer. I'm talking about the fundamental problem with large flows of money going from Western governments and also multilateral institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF going to governments, and why that was corrosive. There's lots of evidence that shows that aid is related to increased inflation in recipient countries. It creates what's called Dutch disease. So it essentially kills off the export sector because there's so many dollars flowing into this country that the local currency becomes so expensive that people from abroad won't be able to buy your products. So very familiar in economics literature, this notion of Dutch disease. There's a lot of evidence of how the aid regime creates dependency. And I would argue, I had in my book over 10 reasons why, sort of the David Letterman, 10 reasons why aid is not contributing to growth in Africa. And the point just being that people who support aid would say, well, actually, no, look, there are 10 girls or 1,000 girls or 10,000 girls that went to school in Africa. Yes, that is true, but that is approaching the fundamental purpose of aid as being a Band-Aid solution, or I would say a risk mitigant, as opposed to creating top-line growth, which is what the original purpose of aid was meant to be. And rather facetiously, Peter Bauer, Lord Bauer, who had been a critic of aid back in the 1960s. He had said that the problem with aid is that it's taxing the poor in rich countries to give the money to the rich in poor countries. And I haven't even mentioned the corruption, but that was essentially his point, that it was leading to corruption.
At TED, we found ourselves right in the middle of this debate back in 2007 when we hosted this conference in Tanzania called Africa, the Next Chapter. And the whole idea of the conference was this was about telling the stories, the amazing stories emerging from Africa that were not of just, look at this problem continent, but look at the amazing things that are happening there. But one of the big debates that erupted was this debate on aid. Bono was there. He'd actually, in some ways, inspired the conference because of a TED Prize wish he gave a couple of years earlier. And, of course, Bono had spent years persuading governments that it was their moral duty to allocate billions of dollars of aid. And it was shocking to him and to others there to see many young Africans stand up with a lot of anger and saying, no, this is causing damage. And I mean, Bono's argument there, and others have argued, is, look, there are times in any continent's life when it's essential to have outside resources coming in. He spoke of the Marshall Plan and, what is the African equivalent of that? At that conference, in the end, the debate became not that all aid was bad, but that we just needed to pay a lot more attention to how it was delivered, how was it monitored, how was it offered, to try and avoid those problems. I mean, is there actually a right way to deliver aid at scale, or do you think that's actually off the table? The only thing we should be talking about is business investment. What's your thoughts on that?
So I think there's a lot to unpick there. I point again to the fact that I'm about results and numbers, and we are living in a time when we have seen success in many countries that were poorer than Africa 60 years ago. And today those countries are, places like China, on a per capita income basis. I mean, they are now lending to the U.S. government, first or second now, largest lender to the U.S. government. What is it that they did? It is the case that there have been aid graduates. So countries like South Korea, Botswana, I talk about these, about 15 countries that have actually done incredibly well. The Marshall Plan is a great example of success on the back of large capital flows coming in. But the key point about those types of programs is that they're short, sharp, and finite. The problem with the aid system in Africa, as I've seen it, is that it is fundamentally an open-ended commitment, essentially seen as in perpetuity. President Kagame of Rwanda, during the blowback against my book, wrote a wonderful 800-word piece in the Financial Times. I did not know him. I'd never communicated with him at all. But he'd seen this sort of backlash against this view and campaigns to try and, undermine me. And he said, listen, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, I don't agree with everything she said in the book, but let's just be clear. Nobody cares more about the African people than Africans themselves. And more than that, it's really important for people to understand that he was talking about public policymakers in Africa, we fundamentally believe that this aid should come to an end at some point. We're not expecting to be dependent on aid forever.
And yet today, the Rwandan economy is, I don't know what the number is, but a significant percentage of it is still funded by external support in some form.
Absolutely. And there is a recognition of that. That doesn't mean that there's not, but that there oughtn't be a transition or at least active discussion to say, okay, look, this is the current situation, but in 50 years, how do we get to a place where every year you're seeing the mix of development finance shift more towards trade, more towards investment, more towards microfinance? I mean, let's just throw stuff on the wall. But we've got to innovate away from a system that is dependent on aid, particularly because the donors are now struggling themselves. I mean, look at the U.S. finances. They've got $1 trillion deficit. They've got enormous debts and liabilities and also obligations that they're not going to be able to meet, according to the Congressional Budget Office. By 2030, we're talking about 10 years from now. We cannot have a whole continent vulnerable because we're sitting there waiting for money to come from heaven. So
if there was one change you could make in the aid system, what would you urge the world to think about?
Well, so for me, ultimately, it's about the efficacy and efficiency of government. That is what we should be aiming for. Anything that undermines government, to my mind, is problematic. It's interesting. I heard something said. There are 4 things that you want from a government. You want a government that is data-driven, is forward-leaning, so forward-looking, focuses on measured outcomes, and has no corruption. And really, if you get those 4 attributes in a government, then you're off to the races, so to speak. I mean, things can really function and work. And in a time when there's so much opportunity for innovation, that is meaningful. The problem, as I've already intimated with the aid system, is that I do believe it was corrosive and remains corrosive for government behavior. The government very easily abdicates its responsibility of providing public goods because somebody else will do it. You know, Bill Gates' foundation might provide healthcare. We'll have the USAID provide education. It's a system that undermines democracy ultimately.
I mean, the implication of what you're saying is that if you are to invest in a country, it should in a sense be conditional on a government being able to deliver on those 4 attributes.
Yes.
But that still leaves this tragic situation then when effectively there are many parts of the world where governments clearly don't stand up to those 4 measures, and yet they have millions of people who are suffering terribly. Do we then just stand aside and say, no, well, we've got to wait until you and your government get your act together and then we'll come in and help? That seems callous as well.
No, of course. I mean, and I'm not going to, we had a cholera outbreak in Southern Africa. We have an energy crisis in Southern Africa right now. I mean, South Africa has just slipped into a recession again. I mean, there are fundamental problems, tsunamis. There are real areas of crisis where we need to step in. So this is not a campaign to say, let's be callous. But I also think that we oughtn't be naive or overly religious about aid. We need to hold governments and societies to the same standards that we hold ourselves to. It is absolutely the case, as far as I'm concerned, that we hold other countries to different standards, which is why people get so frustrated when they think about China and Africa. I mean, China is a lender to the United States. It's investing all across Europe. Nobody seems to be offended by that. But immediately China is investing in Africa, or lending in Africa, everyone's up in arms. Oh, no, they're raping and pillaging. I'm using the words euphemistically, of course, but, they're bringing in their own employees. There's a whole list of why China shouldn't be in Africa. But in a nutshell, I'm not a critic of NGO aid, and I'm not a critic of programs that are there to solve humanitarian crises. I am a critic of fundamental thinking around aid, which, to my mind, has not changed in a material way over the past 60 years.
In your first TED Talk, you spoke about comparing the Chinese government system with that in the West, and how that was being looked at by nations in Africa and elsewhere in the world, and how the West was actually in danger of losing its kind of moral claim to having the best system because of what was actually happening on the ground. Mm-hmm. Talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, and this infuriates me because having lived and worked and studied in the United States and across Europe, I have enjoyed the benefits of a liberal democratic system and a market capitalist system that is constantly evolving, to my mind. Democracy less so, we'll come to that. But really, fundamentally, there's a belief in innovation and change, and I love that. But here are the facts. The system of liberal democracy has only existed for 1% of human time, 1%. So in many respects, this is an aberration. We're living in a period of an aberration. Today, the estimates are about only 30% of the world's population lives in a liberal democracy. You can say, well, it's skewed because large populations such as China do not have the types of liberal democracy that we're referring to. But there's also a lot of statistic that although there are many countries that have democracies today, 70% of those democracies are actually illiberal democracies and indistinguishable from authoritarian states. So what is this telling me? This tells me that actually the reversion to the mean, I think particularly for poor countries, is a society where we don't yet have democracy embedded. And so all the euphoria around democracy, which was really a 1990s into the 2000s phenomena, I think is losing momentum because people are now saying, wait a second, we thought democracy was a prerequisite for economic success. It doesn't feel like that is anymore. And there's wonderful work by a professor named Przeworski, who was at NYU. He talks about how you cannot have democracy without a certain level of per capita income. And he shows that at very different levels of per capita income, your democracy will fail. You end up with factions, you end up with fights, and really only at a certain level of per capita income will you have democracy that lasts come hell or high water. And I think that, to me, is the switch in terms of causality, because we did believe that building liberal democracy would lead to economic growth. But the advent of China, the sort of the falling back that we've seen in Western societies, Germany growing at 0%, income inequality issues, have essentially now reversed that view. And people are now saying, well, actually, no, what you need is government efficiency. So governments are delivering on public goods, education and healthcare and security and infrastructure. And then that creates economic growth, creates a middle class that holds the government accountable.
So push for economic growth before you push for democracy, essentially.
And by the way, my PhD is in economics. It's not in political science, so perhaps I'm talking about my own book.
Well, talk a bit more about economic growth, because in a lot of your writing, you talk about that as a sort of a fundamental goal that the world needs to be pursuing. I've had other people on this podcast arguing the exact opposite. Make the case. Why does economic growth matter?
So, first of all, I'm not naive to the argument against economic growth. People's arguments that actually it has an artifact of not just income inequality, but real concerns around what the degradation of natural resources and environment. I'm very attuned to that. And I'm also very familiar with a lot of the work that people have been sort of investigating around happiness and well-being as new metrics. And I find those particularly interesting. But let me just take a moment to take a step back and think about why we even think about growth. We're trying to figure out, how do we compare across nations in terms of performance, and how do we think about progress over time? The reason growth has become important is that it is to my mind, a prerequisite for solving climate change. You need to have money, you need to have growth, you need to have progress. It's important for innovation and R&D, medical science. We're in the middle of many challenges and disease. How are we going to get those results without there being money to fund those programs? Well, that requires some form of economic growth, education, healthcare, etc. So fundamentally, in terms of just living standards, improvements in living standards, it seems to me that having economic growth as the metric to pursue is critical. Are there different systems to pursue it? Of course there are. Are there risks about what that might mean for corruption or for the degradation of society? Of course. And so that again comes to why we need importantly, we need governments to function properly.
I mean, let's come back to climate change in a minute, because I know a lot of people would say, wait a sec. Economic growth surely is the fundamental cause of the climate crisis that we're in. But I want to come back to that, because what you just said was interesting. But I've heard you also say, and this part I found super compelling, that if you put yourself in a country that's in poverty, your only chance to address that is to have not just meager economic growth, but robust, 5-10% annually. That's what it takes to get people out of poverty. Just to talk about that.
So again, because of numbers, I mean, I think it's important to understand that in order to double per capita incomes in one generation, a generation is about 25 years, you need to be growing at 7% a year. And that is, think about it this way, it's about growth of the pie. The population is growing, and especially in places like Africa, people need to eat, they need housing, they need transportation, they need to be able to communicate. That means the pie has to grow. There is a blowback against that perspective, with people saying, well, the pie doesn't actually need to grow. We just need to separate the pie and redistribute it in a different way. I have a very different view, because I don't think people who are against growth have fully internalized what a diminution or a reduction in living standards actually means. I do know that because I've grown up in Africa. I was just in Africa in December. The conditions that people are living with just in terms of electricity in my own country of Zambia, home country of Zambia, have materially deteriorated from the time that I was growing up there. Materially. The population has increased, and yet there are fewer jobs. And in addition to that, there's no electricity that is cost-effective and reliable. That is a formula for political instability. And so for people who turn around and say to me, we don't need economic growth, or this is, I think that they're misplacing their anger because I think that type of anger and rage should be directed towards finding new solutions to the energy challenges as opposed to trying to shut down the system.
But so I think you'll persuade people that when it comes to addressing like the fundamental human issues of health and education and food and security and having a place to live and survive, that yes, you absolutely need to grow an economy to the point where it can deliver those things. But how can you be sure that economic growth is something to be aimed for after that? Like when Kate Raworth was on the program, she argued, yes, we have to grow people out of conditions of poverty, but that just like a tree or like in nature, something grows for a period and then it shouldn't grow forever. If it grows forever, then it's a cancer, not a tree. And there was something compelling about that argument. Why do you think that economic growth is needed beyond that phase of just getting people to the point where they can live a stable life where they are in control of their destiny?
Because we don't know any society that has ever reached the point that she's referring to, and frankly, I don't know. At what point are we satiated? Do we say, oh, actually, we've got 50% of the population is now above a certain level of per capita income? Too bad for the bottom 50%, but we're not going to focus on any more growth. And I'm saying this kind of flippantly, but the truth of the matter is there are many middle-income countries that are in exactly that position. I mentioned South Africa a moment ago, Malaysia. This is where they call this middle-income trap, where countries get to a certain point, but fundamentally the growth stalls, which is ultimately what campaigners are saying. We don't want any more growth. Okay, you've got your growth stalling, but what do you do with society that has not been moved out of poverty? And I would argue that is not an equilibrium that is sustainable. I think it's the income inequality challenges that we're seeing.
Well, so the inequality piece, though, is a core part of this, because some countries that do focus on growth and champion it, often the beneficiaries of that growth has been solely, the top 1%, effectively.
Yeah, absolutely right.
So isn't it more powerful, rather than focusing on growth, to at least for a rich country, to focus on sorting out some of those issues of inequality, unequal distribution?
Yes, I think that is it's absolutely on the agenda. The issue of income inequality is absolutely on the agenda of not only public policy and international organizations. It is absolutely on the agenda of corporations as well. And so it's not like people aren't thinking about these issues. My concern is, like most issues around public policy, there is a temptation to just find a Band-Aid solution. Oh, let's just tax and spend more, which is, again, going back to my pie analogy. They don't care about expanding the pie. All they care about is just redistribution, chopping up the pie. I don't subscribe to that view. And rather than focus on chopping up the pie or income and distribution, which, universal basic income, those types of proposals, I think those are very short term. As having raised in Africa, being an aid recipient, that is tax and redistribution. It hasn't worked as far as I'm concerned. I'm much more interested in programs that think about people's ability to move from one income group to another. That is where we have failed. That's where I think public policy needs to work. They need to invest in education. Objectively look at education statistics in the West. They are poor and declining. So, and again, my instinct is we know what to do, but we're not doing it, and then somehow are surprised that we're getting bad results.
talk a bit more about climate change? So a lot of people in the climate movement, the argument would be, look, we've been growing our economy for years, fundamentally driven by the miracle of fossil fuels, but has this sort of terrible side effect of filling up the atmosphere with heating gases that are going to be the death of us. How can more economic growth be a solution?
So the consequences of a lack of energy are damning. And, as somebody who has actually lived this experience, not 20 years ago, just 2 months ago, being in South Africa, being in Zambia, where there's load shedding, you only get electricity for 2 hours, and maybe it's at midnight to 2 a.m. The consequences, the second order effects of that environment are so damning in terms of the delivery of healthcare, in terms of education. For my druthers, I am also on the Oxford University's endowment investment committee. And there is a massive push from the student body to defund the energy companies, mainly fossil fuel companies, which I feel is wholly misplaced. They see no irony in the fact that they would like to have, the student body, would like to have more diversity. We want to have more African students, more South Americans, more Asians. But they don't see that the consequences of campaigning for defunding are actually leading to fewer, not more chances for Africans to actually be students in Oxford in years to come.
But isn't the question, though, there, whether the only way to solve that energy crisis, and I agree it's a crisis. I mean, electricity is crucial to just be part of modern life. But does it have to come from fossil fuels?
But here's the thing. The question is, where is the innovation coming from? There are, let's say 8 billion of us on the planet. I am a fundamental believer in creative destruction. If there was somebody on this planet today who knew how to produce at scale cost-effective energy, we would know about it. Nobody is hiding the deep, dark secret of how to create energy. Creating energy from hydrocarbons in the form of fossil fuels is hard. It's difficult. But I can assure you that energy companies, and also in general governments, 80% of energy is produced by state-owned organizations like Saudi Aramco, etc. Though all these organizations are invested heavily in the full stack of energy, whether it's fourth-generation nuclear, water, solar, biofuels, amoeba, and algae. I mean, wind. I mean, the stack is full. Battery, geothermal. I mean, I could go on and on. It's not like people aren't trying to find a solution. So defunding these is not going to get us to a solution faster.
Well, it depends on who is actually pushing those solutions. So if it was the case that fossil fuel companies were spending this intense effort and investing in these,
which they are.
Well, so some of them are, and actually,
I don't know a single one that is not, and that thinks that it could survive in this environment. I can tell you that I know. I happen to serve on a board of an energy company.
Of Chevron, right?
Yes,
yeah.
And it's public, so it's not a big. Yeah. And I actually believe very fundamentally in the need to produce energy. But it's not just Chevron. The whole industry. Our competitors, there's not a single one that I can think of that is not invested heavily in this space to try and move to renewables.
So I think that's good. I mean, there's a debate about whether some are doing it kind of as a PR effort rather than seriously. Some definitely seem to be doing it very, very
Chris,
seriously.
If they are, they're not. It's innovate or die is my view. It's an existential crisis. So you know what? The market will shake those out. If they're not taking it seriously, they will not be companies that survive.
Right, because the fundamental economics seem to be that non-fossil fuel forms of energy are winning. They're relentlessly getting lower in cost, and it's a matter of time before they take over the world, essentially.
Let's see. I mean, that's creative destruction. Let's see if that happens. And the bottom line is those fossil fuel companies are invested in those businesses.
Well, if I was a student protester in Oxford, I would say that at the least, the investment philosophy of the fund should be linked to companies proving that they were spending money on carbon zero forms of energy.
But again, I'm saying that I don't know of any company. And let me just focus on the largest ones. I don't know of any large company that is producing energy that is not focused on these specific areas, about renewable energy, looking for more cleaner forms, more efficient forms. They're extremely transparent on this. Our competitors are extremely transparent on this. So I don't know what students are looking for.
Isn't one test to me would be, okay, take your whole investment resources. How much of those are going on zero carbon energy forms, and how much are going on, exploring new sources of oil and natural gas and coal? And that, at least last time I looked at the numbers, there were companies that were literally making the thrust of their investments on, we're going to transition, there's this amazing story in solar and wind, that's where our future is. And there were others that were investing, yes, $2 or $3 billion in renewable energy, but $25-30 billion or more annually still in traditional oil exploration, etc. Isn't it fair to say that latter, there's a problem there?
This is the beauty with the markets. This is why I just spent 10 years of my life on Wall Street, because if you believe that that's the case, you're able not only to not invest in those companies, you can choose to decide, this company is not doing enough, but you can also short the market. You can actually decide, I want to take a bet that this company is going to go down. And I actually think that is the kind of market transparency and discussion we should be having. What I take issue with is the naivete, as far as I'm concerned, and lack of understanding that these companies are necessary. They need a seat at the table because innovation around energy is extremely difficult. Have a look at the Netflix Inside Bill Gates' Brain. I don't know if you've seen it already, but it's brilliant because Bill Gates picks 3 things that he's passionate about. He wants to do sanitation, he wants to eradicate polio, and he wants to sort out the energy question. You know what? I think it's fair to say he lands in the place where none of those things have been solved. There's still sanitation issues around the world. He's not been able to eradicate polio for a whole host of reasons, and he's not been able to crack the energy system. Let's appreciate that these are not normative yes or no questions. They're hard, difficult challenges, and we need everyone on deck to solve it.
Yeah, no question. I mean, many people would say it's the existential question that humanity faces this century, is to try and figure this one out. Of can you get to that clean energy world, and when, like the clock's ticking.
And by the way, the IEA, the International Energy Association Agency, has said you're still going to have a large proportion of that energy stack coming from fossil fuels. Not because, in fact, I should just say, Chris, I think where there's more value to be had is let's see how much these campaigners are willing to give in their living standards. Are they willing to have electricity only 2 hours a day, and so that Africans can have more electricity? I mean, let's have that debate in the short term, rather than trying to defund companies who are at the coalface, really at the tip of the spear in innovation.
I think the IEA may say that, but I think a lot of other people would say that if it was the case that a large part of the energy stack in 2050 was fossil fuels, we're screwed. That is a world where the temperature rises more than 3 degrees Celsius, and the impacts of that are probably going to be absolutely catastrophic. I think that's what the IPCC, the scientists would say, right?
And I've read the IPCC report, and I subscribe to the fact that we have a climate change issue. What I have an issue with is the resistance against people who have got lots of expertise and knowledge about how to create energy, and who are investing not just time and effort, but money as well, inordinate amounts of money, to try and crack the answer, being shunned or not being included in the discussion.
As far as Africa and other places where so many millions of people are without electricity, I mean, a few years ago, it felt like the debate was people recognized that economic growth and the provision of energy there was essential, and that it was deeply unfair for the West, for example, to say climate is an issue. You can't have that growth because here we are rich in the West, and the argument would be, look, this is just a fundamental right. But it feels like the debate's shifting now to the possibility that there is this amazing leapfrog that many nations could make to avoid the development path that the West has made, which has been largely powered by fossil fuels, for example, and to go to just much more efficient ways of delivering energy, precisely because the technology has changed. The sun is everywhere, for example, the wind is everywhere. You can harvest it locally at a lower cost. And so that hopefully, there's a way in which we can both allow that form of economic growth that doesn't contribute to the climate crisis and still bring millions of people, to a better life.
I don't think anyone would find that objectionable. But again, let's talk about live, real situations. Once again, I point to South Africa because this is a real, live situation. This is a country, I believe they've got about 50 million people. They've got 25% unemployment. Population has been growing. They have had serious shortages of electricity. There's been a severe drought in Victoria Falls, which is where the Kariba Dam is, which is supposed to be providing hydroelectricity. That has not happened. I mentioned to you South Africa is not only facing a downgrade in its credit rating, but it has significant economic growth challenges. This is a country who's growing closer to 1% to 2%, if not lower. Remember, relative to 7%, you are not going to solve these problems. What are they supposed to do? Yes, they should be looking at more innovative ways of creating energy. I can't believe that they haven't explored the options of wind or solar, but can they deliver that at scale and in a cost-effective way to their population? It seems, based on what I'm hearing and reading, it seems that they've come to the position that they cannot. And they are leaning towards a coal solution, which many of us would say is not an ideal solution, certainly not vis-a-vis climate change. But these are the trade-offs these governments are making, and we have to go back to governments and ask them why they're doing that.
Well, it's a very intense debate right now. Tell me about when you published Dead Aid and in the debate that followed from that, where you had, economists on the left like Jeffrey Sachs were upset by the book and so forth, and like you were positioned very much as a sort of an economist of the right for a while. And in our discussions and in some of your more recent work, which I want to come on to, that's really not how you think of your position. How do you think of your own sort of, are you aligned politically? How should we think of you?
So, Chris, I like to view myself as a pragmatist. I'm a numbers person. I don't think the numbers lie. Of course, I have a range of values that I deeply believe. I believe in freedom freedom for everybody in terms of liberal democracy. As a Black woman from Africa, I believe in immigration. I believe in women's rights. And so many people would say, well, those are very left-leaning tenets. Socially, I would say absolutely on the left. Women's choice, the list is quite long. On the other hand, I do believe in responsible government. I do believe government has a responsibility to provide public goods. So I'm not a libertarian in the sense that the government should, virtually not exist. I think the government should exist, but I'm very focused on the efficacy of government. I also believe in the markets, though. I believe that the markets are the best form for innovation and for R&D. And I do believe that there are many aspects of markets innovation that we do need. People would say those are very right-leaning views. I was not raised in the West in this box-ticking kind of world. I have my views. I formed my views based on having a PhD, spending a lot of time in research. I formed part of my views working at the World Bank, which is, more focused on civic society. The utility function, they're very different from the time that I spent 10 years working at Goldman Sachs, which is a finance company, working on boards, working in academia. So I've had a portfolio of experiences that have made me feel like it's important to be much more pragmatic than to blindly choose your ideology based on, what you think a box should say. So, in short, I'm much more of a pragmatist.
And in fact, this idea that is at the heart of, I would say, traditional conservative or right-leaning economics, which is it starts with the freedom of the individual, and that if you start with that and build an economic system from that, that's how you get to free market capitalism and so forth. But recently, you've been writing and thinking about this idea of the price of freedom.
Yes,
which in some ways is a challenge to some of that fundamental bedrock. And I'd like to hear you articulate some of that. What are you thinking about?
So, I think Western economics, if I can call it that, which is the economics that I studied at Harvard and then at Oxford, is I think, understand that it's limited in its ability to properly calibrate or cost the costs of freedom. So we all love freedom. We love private benefits of, freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of choice. For example, I can eat as much as I like. Nobody's going to stop me. And when Mike Bloomberg, when he was mayor, tried to curb that was essentially brought to debate. I can have as many children as I like. No one's going to tell me that it has to be capped at a certain number. Again, it's a private choice, private benefit. But we have not been good at really calibrating or costing out what the societal costs of those private benefits really is. So, for example, I can eat as much as I like. There's a risk that I could end up with type 2 diabetes. The way that societies work, even in the United States, where there's not a sort of a socialized healthcare system, if I'm on the street dying from type 2 diabetes, society will step in and they'll provide some form of infrastructure. In this case, it would be Medicaid, in my example. And so we realize that there are costs because the marginal dollar that in that case, which is it's not a great example, but in that case would keep me alive, would be taken away from infrastructure or a kid going to school. But there's a more fundamental issue here, which is what are the levers that government has in a democracy to try and adjust this balance between private benefit and societal costs? We know that in a democracy, it's very difficult to try and recalibrate, as we saw, as I said, with the soda tax. But it goes further. We can talk about the coronavirus and the issues around disease. Ability for a authoritarian government to say, gosh, this is a private benefit of me walking around downtown, but actually societal cost of me infecting society. Well, guess what? The government has a lever to say everybody's staying home, not translating or translatable in Western society where people do not believe they should be told to do something.
I mean, is your concern or your argument even that in the West we are increasingly seeing that the freedom that is encapsulated in the idea of democracy, that everyone votes, we choose the governments we want, and then, try and build the best systems out of that through our free markets, that those systems are failing to some extent in comparison with some of what's happening elsewhere in the world, and that we may have to consciously decide either to restrict freedoms or just accept that there is this higher cost associated with it?
I would say it's less about that's failure, that's success. It's more about, are we innovating enough to adapt to the challenges that we're facing? So when the Congressional Budget Office in the United States says, hey, guys, by 2030, you're not going to be able to pay for Medicare and Medicaid, you've got too much debt, etc. How does the political system help us get to an environment where we can actually resolve that crisis? One of the things that we've touched on in this conversation has been around how willing are we to absorb those costs as individuals. So whether it's climate change, am I willing to reduce my living standards? Understanding that, gosh, my decision might be hurting someone else. It's not clear that we are there as individuals. And shorthand, in China, the view is that the government just says, I know human beings. They just don't do what's right for themselves or for society. So I need to be quite tough in terms of policing individuals. We don't like that as Westerners. But if we are going to say we don't want to have that type of heavy-handed government, we do have to accept that there are going to be more costs. And that means our living standards could be at risk.
Let's just focus on the coronavirus for a minute. They're just such interesting thought experiments right now that to try and draw out which kind of society we want. In the West, someone is diagnosed with the virus and is advised to stay at home, and they ignore the advice and go off to a party. Many others get sick. The bug spreads out of control. In China, they distribute an app on your phone that tracks whether you have been close to areas of infection. and it may issue you with a red alert saying you must self-quarantine now, you are in danger, our algorithms have determined that this is a problem. And at the same time, messages the local police that that this alert has been issued, that could be really effective in terms of controlling the virus. Indeed, the steps they've taken have been effective. Like which system would you choose of those two?
Well, I would prefer to know myself. But this is why this area is such an interesting thing for me, because I also like the fact that we have freedom to choose. But the questions, I can police my own behavior, but am I sure that my colleague at work or friend on this, a personal friend or someone I meet on the street is also policing their behavior? Or maybe they even have nefarious motivations. I mean, it's hard to contain a disease if people are behaving antithetically to what is recommended by the state.
So do you think we will have to move to a world that is less free?
What I'm saying is that I think that's up for debate. So my sense is that is a world I think we have to consider realistically. When I think about even Bernie Sanders' surge recently, I think there's a recognition that actually by young people that we need public health care. And there are lots of arguments on both sides, and we're not going to here to talk about that. But I think that is an example of where I think people are starting to say, well, actually, hang on, maybe bigger state is relevant, is important. And there is a cost to that, but we can accept that. The China thing is interesting also because their response to coronavirus is just the most recent venture in this type of thinking, this thinking of how does the government police 1.3 billion people. Sesame program, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with, is very interesting. What they've done is they say, hey, listen, Chris, you're a good guy. At the weekend, you're taking your nieces and nephews to play soccer. We think that's good for society. The kids are getting some exercise, they're learning teamwork, etc. Because you're such a good guy, we're going to give you credits, state credits that are in this pool, this bank, like an Equifax kind of bank. And if you come to us tomorrow and you say, you know what, I'm not feeling so well, I need to go to the hospital, you can jump the line and get priority health care because you've been a good guy, you've been a good citizen. These types of innovations are exercises we should be talking about, but I know they're completely antithetical to Western society. I don't want the government spying on me. I don't want the government to pry. But there are so many areas that we're moving into. Another very quick one is if you're a pharmaceutical company, so let's suppose you're GSK or you're Merck, and in the United States, you have real constraints around using people's data, so data privacy laws. In China, they may be a little bit more lax. It's not to say that it's free reign, but they might be a bit more lax. How do we feel about people or drug companies coming up with medical solutions that we need, whether it's coronavirus or something else, based on them drawing off of broader databases? If you're on the board of GSK, how do you think about that? Should you invest in China and maybe be able to get the leading drug much faster because you've got a bigger data set? Or do you say, wait a second, no, our values, our Western values around data sets and therefore has to be much more curbed? I just think there's a lot more on this.
I mean, if there was one reform that you would like to see at least debated and maybe pushed through, what would that be?
It would probably be a combination of revisiting voting. So, as you know, the voting participation numbers are very low in many Western countries, including the United States. I think that there has to be more innovation. If you want one man, one vote, as we used to say back in the day, then we need to do a lot. You can't have 30% voting record for low income and expect that is really reflective of the policies that society wants. So I think that would be certainly be one thing. The other thing,
how could you improve that? Like compulsory voting, or
yes, I think compulsory voting is one example. There are about 20 countries, Australia, across Europe, a lot of countries in South America that have compulsory voting. Again, it flies in the face of freedom, but conceptually, I think it's something that we should have a real debate about. And I have to believe that society is smart. People are smart. And they look at this and they say there's something fundamentally wrong here. Let's talk about what those solutions might be. It may not just be compulsory voting, but that's one example. The other thing I would say is what we're really talking about here is ultimately about trade-offs between short-term and long-term, it seems to me. We are in a world where there are a lot of long-term problems that are emerging. So even in the case of disease, the CDC has talked for many years, the Center for Disease Control in the United States has talked for many years about how we should expect, and we are seeing, the prevalence and incidence of disease increase. SARS, H1N1, Ebola, Zika. There are just many more of them. Very big risks of communicable diseases, and now obviously coronavirus. But the short-termism in corporations, the short-termism in public life and policymaking means that we don't really think about this whole host of headwinds, technology and the risk of the jobless underclass, demographic shift. There are going to be 11 billion people on the planet. How are we going to deal with that? That's multiples more that we've ever seen in history or prehistory, and more growth than we'll ever see after 2100. What do we think about income inequality? These are structural problems, climate change, environment, natural resource scarcity, but they're so long-term and our political systems are so short-term that, so to your question, what would I change? It's those two things, voting participation and really trying to resolve the embedded risk of short-termism.
I mean, that short-term thinking, I think a lot of people would be nodding their heads vigorously on that. Mm. It's almost like it's a human bug in cognition, right? That we most of our evolutionary history, we've never had the luxury of being able to think too much about the long term. It's like survive the next day, and that's a win. And so it's no surprise that our thinking is a bit biased that way. And in a way, that almost comes back to this. This fundamental idea of freedom that has been elevated to this huge degree in so much of our ideology, and it makes you wonder whether we have got that right, and that we actually could be much more sophisticated in how we define freedom, and actually say, as I think you are, freedom is not an unalloyed good in every circumstance. That it comes with dangers and with prices. I was brought up religious and was taught that there were two types of freedom. There was the external freedom that you weren't allowed to do something, and that was what most of the world obsessed over. But that actually wasn't the most important freedom. The most important freedom was internal freedom, to be free from your internal demons, for want of a better word. Mm. That people were fighting all the time to do the right thing, and were often being tempted to do the wrong thing. And unless you could own yourself, you were not free. And so, viewed one way, many of the sort of the woes of the modern world are because people have forgotten that type of internal freedom that they lack. And you just give people freedom to do anything. And so you give them a cell phone, give them a publishing platform, and suddenly they're free to spew poison to the internet. And we discover that there's a lot of poison out there. Is the only way to avoid these problems to restrict freedom and kind of take a more sort of Chinese model, for want of a better word? Or might we be able to educate ourselves better about who we actually are and the circumstances in which we can be free and flourish, and the circumstances in which we have to sort of self-restrict or find the sort of the discipline and the ways to outwit our internal flaws and quirks and bugs?
So I think it's a wonderful question in the sense that I have always written my books with the view that humanity is good, is right, and when we end up with bad policies, it's because people just didn't know. So the aid example is a great example. I just figured, actually, Western donors are not sort of nefarious behind a dark curtain. They just don't know that there's these negative effects, notwithstanding the literature. And so I generally take the view, actually, if we give people more information, more of an understanding of the trade-offs and the choices that they're making, what does it mean for society, I want to believe that they'll make the right choice. Now, the truth of the matter is that some people would say that's extremely naive. And again, I point to the fact that even though I know that maybe eating 5 cases of ice cream is a bad thing, it's not the case that I will resist doing that myself, which is damaging for myself, and I think the Chinese would argue is damaging for society. The problem is that human beings are human beings. They're not machines, and therefore do not make the quote-unquote right choice, even if it's looking at them right in their face. And so then it comes to the second option, which is, okay, well, if that's the case, should we have a reduction in freedoms? And that's what I'm exploring in my work, because I am genuinely curious about what amount of freedom are we willing to give without it really flying in the face of the things that we do love about freedom, which is the innovation, the R&D, the curiosity, the creativity, which we don't want to kill off because government becomes so heavy-handed. So it's a delicate balance. I've been thinking a lot about, are there any societies that have managed to sort of have that balance in a way that might be worth exploring? And they're not obvious to me. I think we tend to think about the U.S. and China as being at the two extremes, and I just can't think of anybody who's really in the middle that has actually got the great innovation. People might say Scandinavia, but great innovation, great R&D, but at the same time have some restrictions on behaviors.
So as you look to the future, you look at the world and where we're at, where are you on the kind of pessimism, optimism spectrum right now, Dambisa?
So, I'll do short-term, long-term. Short-term, really worried. I think the discourse doesn't really characterize or doesn't really focus on the deep structural issues that I outlined. What are we going to do with a jobless underclass? What about the splinternet? The fact that the world's, technologies might be two competing platforms in China and the U.S. What about AI? What about demographics? And India's adding 1 million people a month to the population, 1 million a month. What are we going to do with all these people? Disorderly immigration. What do we think about climate change? We talked about natural resource scarcity. How are we going to continue to provide improved living standards? There's a whole list of issues that are long-term, and I just don't feel get enough airtime in a quality, thoughtful way. So there's a lot of shooting from the hip and lots of shouting, but there's not real discussion that I participate in. But longer term, I think to myself, gosh, I'm a little speck in the world. If you just take a step back, go read history, go look at history of art, history of the world, and you realize that we're just here for a speck, and the world continues to survive and to thrive. And so I remain optimistic that we will find solutions to some of the problems that people might even think are existential crises for humanity. I have to believe that whether it's through technology and science, and as they say in Silicon Valley, just because you don't know what's coming doesn't mean that something good is not coming. And so I hope that they're right and it's not something bad.
I mean, there's a part of me, possibly just the idealistic and optimistic and naive part of me, but there's part of me that wants to believe that the global threats that we're currently facing, like this epidemic, like climate change, will force countries, people around the world to come together and try to, first of all, take them on together, battle them together, and force us to take the best of each other's ways of life, ideas, thinking, and try, and find some middle way that draws on all of that, so that it becomes, as we look back from 10 years' time, we see sort of graduation from sort of these divided worldviews to, in the modern world, we're all going to have to borrow from each other and allow room for freedoms and innovation, and allow big emphasis on the common good and the need to give up certain things for that common good.
Listen, I hope you're right. I think the cynic would say, well, come on, Chris, isn't that where we were with multilateralism? And where did that end up? Ultimately, we live in a world of zero-sum, and all politics is local. And therefore, so we don't want waste in our backyards. Let's just pay, Ghana, take our waste, and, not just physical waste, but also we don't want these Guantanamo Bay prisoners in our backyard. Just get rid of it. That is a real society in which we live today. Again, I don't think there's enough of a manifesto of these questions that Westerners are saying, actually, you know what? When we say we want everybody to be free and everyone to be equal, are you willing for the waste to be in your backyard? That's fine. Are you willing to have less electricity because of climate change issues? Let's have that debate. Are you willing to see not just living standards decline, but also have, a ex-Guantanamo Bay prisoner who's been released living right down the street from you? I'm not sure, but I think this is where the freedom debate is going to head.
Yeah, that's definitely what a cynic would say. I'm curious what Dambisa says. I mean,
I'm an eternal optimist.
leave us with one thing that you think we should pay attention to going forward. One idea that people listening to this should just focus on.
Well, I do think that we should focus on. I think that really two things. I think when I think about 10 years from now, I think it's going to be China and technology. I really do. I think those are going to be the defining trends and themes of our time. And when I forecast my own life 10 years from now, and I think about making bets about how I should live my life, where I should invest my time, how should I allocate my capital and my resources, those are the things that are important drivers.
Dambisa, you've given us so much food for thought there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. I really enjoyed being here. Thank you.
Global economist Dambisa Moyo. Check out both of her TED Talks at TED.com. And look, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us what you think of the show by rating and reviewing us in Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Your reviews make a difference. We read all of them. We do appreciate your feedback. This week's show was produced by Dan O'Donnell at Transmitter Media. Our production manager is Roxanne Hylash. Our show is mixed by David Herman. Our theme music is by Alison Leighton Brown. Special thanks to my colleagues Michelle Quint and Grace Rubenstein. Thank you for listening to the TED Interview. I'm Chris Anderson. Stay safe. See you again soon.
PRX.